The hall was too quiet for something this dangerous, not the kind of quiet that meant peace, but the kind that came right before something broke. Every sound felt swallowed before it could fully exist. Even footsteps didn't echo properly here. They vanished into the thick ceremonial silence of the bonding chamber, as if the building itself refused to repeat what was about to happen. And at the center of it all stood her, Alina Vire. Her breathing was steady, but only because she had trained herself not to show fear in front of predators, especially not in front of him. Across from her, seated on the elevated obsidian throne carved into the council dais, was Alpha Kale Draven, the most feared name in the Northern Territories. A man spoken of in lowered voices, in warnings, in unfinished sentences. A man who didn't just command loyalty, he made disobedience feel like a physical impossibility. And yet, right now, Alina Vire was doing the unthinkable. She was looking him dead in the eye and saying, "This mate deal is fake. It always has been." A ripple moved through the chamber. Not sound, reaction. The council members didn't gasp, they didn't speak, they didn't dare. Instead, they shifted slightly in their seats, like people witnessing a storm approaching but realizing too late they had nowhere to run. The guards near the pillars tightened their grip on their spears. And Kale? Kale didn't react at all. That was the first wrong thing, because powerful men always react. They get angry, they smirk, they threaten, they punish. But Kale Draven simply sat there, one elbow resting on the arm of his throne, fingers loosely interlocked, as if she had just made a comment about the weather. His silver-gray eyes didn't even blink. "You're mistaken," he said calmly. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It slid through the chamber like something alive, something that didn't belong to human anatomy. Alina forced herself not to step back. "I'm not mistaken," she replied. "I read the contract. I know what I signed. This bond is temporary, political, strategic. Nothing more. There is no real mate bond here." A few council members exchanged glances. One of them, an older man with bone-white hair and ceremonial markings along his neck, shifted uneasily. Another whispered under his breath, "She shouldn't be saying this in front of him." But Alina didn't care. She had been trained for infiltration, negotiation, and survival in hostile regimes. Fear was something she had learned to compartmentalize. Or at least, she used to think she had. Because Kale Draven's silence was starting to feel heavier than any threat he could have spoken out loud. Then, finally, he leaned forward slightly. Just a fraction. And somehow, the entire room felt it, like gravity had changed direction. "You're certain it's fake?" he asked. "Yes," she said immediately. Too quickly. A mistake she realized only after the words left her mouth. Kale's gaze sharpened, not emotionally, intellectually, like a blade adjusting its angle before a strike. For the first time, something flickered in his expression. Not anger. Interest. And that was worse, because interest from a man like Kale Draven didn't mean curiosity. It meant calculation. Alina felt it then, a faint pressure at the base of her neck, just beneath the skin. She ignored it. She couldn't afford distractions. "This arrangement ends tonight," she said firmly. "I complete my objective, and I leave this territory. No extensions, no attachments, no illusions of destiny or fate, or whatever myth your council believes in." A few council members flinched at the word myth. But Kale only tilted his head slightly, and then he said something that didn't belong in the conversation at all. "Do you feel it yet?" Silence. Alina frowned. "Feel what?" Kale didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood. That alone made the entire chamber shift. Every guard straightened. Every council member froze. Because Kale Draven standing wasn't just movement, it was escalation. He stepped down from the dais slowly, each step echoing softly, deliberately, until he stood on the same ground as her, only a few feet away, close enough now that she could see the faint scar cutting through his left eyebrow, close enough that she could feel the temperature shift around him. "You entered this chamber wearing a lie," he said quietly, "but lies have a cost." Alina's jaw tightened. "I don't know what game you think you're playing." "I'm not playing," he interrupted. Simple, cold, absolute. Then he took one more step closer. And that's when it happened. A sharp pulse of heat erupted across Alina's collarbone. Painful, sudden, like something inside her skin had woken up. She staggered half a step back before catching herself. Her hand flew instinctively to her chest. What is that?" she whispered. Kale's eyes dropped briefly to the exact spot she was touching, and for the first time, something unreadable passed through his expression. Not surprise, not shock. Recognition. Behind them, the council erupted into murmurs. "That shouldn't be possible. The mark is activating. She's not stabilized yet." Alina barely heard them, because the sensation under her skin was spreading, like ink being poured through veins that didn't exist a moment ago. A symbol, something forming, burning into her flesh from the inside out. Her breath caught sharply. "No," she whispered. "This is not part of the contract." Kale's voice dropped lower, dangerously calm. "It never was." And that was when the world tilted, because suddenly Alina wasn't standing in a negotiation chamber anymore. She was standing inside something much older, something designed, something intentional. Her vision blurred for half a second, and in that half second she saw flashes. Not memories, not hers, something else. A dark ritual circle. A council of 12 standing in shadow. A name spoken in binding language she had never been taught. And her. Always her. At the center. When her vision snapped back, she was breathing harder. Her heart was no longer under her control. "What did you do to me?" she demanded. Kyle didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the inside of his coat and pulled out a folded piece of black-edged parchment. He held it up between them. "The contract you signed," he said. Alina shook her head sharply. "That's impossible. I reviewed it. There was nothing—" "There was everything," he cut in. He unfolded it, but she didn't look at the paper. She couldn't. Because the mark on her skin was now visible through the fabric of her uniform, glowing faintly, responding to the document, as if it recognized it. Alina's breath hitched. "No," she said again, quieter this time. "No, no, no, this is not real. This is not happening." Kyle stepped even closer now. Too close. Close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to maintain eye contact. And then he said it, the sentence that shattered the entire illusion she had built her mission on. "You didn't enter a fake mate agreement," he said. "You activated a dormant bond." The chamber erupted. Gasps this time. Actual sound. But Alina couldn't hear it properly anymore. Her ears were ringing. Her mind was trying and failing to reject what he was saying. "That's impossible," she said again, but weaker now. "I would have known. I would have felt it. I would have—" "You were never meant to feel it early," Kyle said. His voice softened slightly, not with sympathy, with certainty. "And now that it's awake, there's no undoing it." Alina took another step back, then another, until her back nearly touched one of the chamber pillars. Her hand was still pressed against her chest. The mark was still burning, like it was responding to proximity, to him. Kale Draven watched her carefully. Not like a captor, not like a lover, like a man watching a locked mechanism finally click into place. "You walked in here believing you were in control," he said. "That was your second mistake." Alina swallowed hard. And the first? Kale's eyes darkened slightly. You assumed you were chosen by accident. That sentence landed heavier than anything before it. Because somewhere in her training, somewhere buried beneath every mission file and encrypted instruction, a small voice she had ignored was starting to scream. This was planned. All of it. The contract, the assignment, even her presence here. Alina forced her voice to steady. If this is some kind of manipulation tactic, it isn't, Kale said simply. No emotion, no hesitation, just truth. Or something that sounded too much like it to ignore. The mark on her skin pulsed again, harder this time, and her knees nearly buckled. Kale stepped forward instinctively as if to catch her, but stopped himself. That hesitation meant something. Alina noticed it. Even through the pain, even through the chaos in her mind. You knew this would happen, she said slowly. Kale didn't deny it. That silence was the answer. The council room felt suddenly too small, too watched, too structured. Like every pillar, every guard, every breath had been positioned around a truth she had been walking toward without knowing it. Alina straightened again, forcing strength back into her spine. Then tell me something clearly, she said, voice sharper now. Kale met her gaze. If this bond is real, she continued, then what am I to you? For the first time since she entered the chamber, Kale didn't answer immediately, and in that silence, something dangerous began to form between them, something neither of them had fully prepared for, and that is where everything fractures. Because if you were in her place, standing in a chamber where your entire reality suddenly stopped making sense, watching the most dangerous man alive confirm that your life was built on a hidden bond you never agreed to, would you run immediately or stay long enough to uncover the truth? And more importantly, if someone powerful had the ability to bind your fate without your knowledge, would you want the truth, even if it destroyed everything you believed about yourself? She didn't answer him right away, not because she didn't hear him, but because her mind had started doing something far more dangerous than panic. It was trying to rationalize what was happening. That was always the first trap. Not fear, not confusion. Rationalization. The desperate human instinct to force impossible things into something familiar enough to survive. Alina Vire stood pressed against the cold stone pillar of the bonding chamber, her fingers still hovering over the glowing mark beneath her collarbone, feeling it pulse like a second heartbeat that did not belong to her. Kale Draven remained where he was, close enough now that she could feel his presence like pressure against her skin, but still not touching her. That distance was deliberate, controlled, measured. The kind of restraint that was more terrifying than aggression. Around them, the chamber had shifted from shock into silent calculation. The council members no longer looked surprised. They looked alert, watching, waiting, as if this moment was not an interruption, but an expected escalation in a sequence they had already prepared for. That realization alone tightened something in Alina's chest. And because if everyone else knew this was coming, then she was never part of the equation. She was the variable, the test subject, the unknown. Kale's voice broke through the silence again, lower now, stripped of ceremony. You still haven't answered my question, he said. Alina forced her gaze up to him. Her throat felt tight, but her voice came out steady enough to mask it. And you still haven't explained why my body is reacting to something I never agreed to. A faint shift moved across his expression, not annoyance, not surprise, but something closer to assessment, like a strategist adjusting to an unexpected move on a board he thought he had already mastered. You're reacting because your body remembers what your mind was never allowed to know, he said. That sentence landed too precisely, too deliberately. Alina exhaled slowly through her nose, forcing control back into her breathing. That's not how biology works, she said immediately, or contracts, or anything in this system. It is, Kale replied, when the system was built to override consent at the genetic level. The chamber seemed to tighten around that statement. Even the guards shifted slightly. Not in reaction to emotion, but in reaction to protocol. Like that phrase triggered something older than the conversation itself. Alina narrowed her eyes. You're saying I was engineered to respond to you? A faint silence followed. Not denial, not agreement, calculation. Then Kale stepped just half a pace closer again. Not enough to threaten, enough to dominate space without crossing it. I'm saying you were matched, he corrected. Long before you ever stepped into this chamber. Her pulse spiked. Not from fear alone anymore, from something more destabilizing, recognition trying to form without permission. That's impossible, she said again, but this time it didn't carry conviction. It carried resistance. Kale tilted his head slightly. Is it? He asked. And then, instead of continuing verbally, he did something that shifted the entire dynamic of the room. He reached into his coat again and produced a second document, older than the first, edges worn, markings layered with council insignia that no longer existed in current law. He didn't hand it to her. He didn't offer it. He simply held it where she could see it. Alina didn't move closer at first. She studied it from a distance. May her training screaming at her not to engage with unknown artifacts in a compromised environment. But her eyes still locked onto it, because the mark on her skin pulsed again the moment it entered her line of sight. That was not coincidence anymore. That was response. What is that? She asked carefully. The origin clause, Kale said. The words meant nothing to her, and yet her body reacted as if they meant everything. A faint heat spread under her skin again, sharper this time, more directional, as if something inside her was reaching toward the document. Alina swallowed. That's not a recognized legal term. Not anymore, Kale said. But it was. The council members behind him remained silent, but one of them lowered his gaze. Not guilt, not shame, something closer to avoidance. Alina noticed that. She noticed everything now. That was what made it worse, because the more she observed, the more pieces refused to fit into the version of reality she had been trained to trust. You brought me here under false pretenses, she said slowly, shifting from confusion into controlled accusation. You assigned me a mission under the assumption that I was infiltrating a fake bond arrangement. That is still the official record I was given. Kale's eyes didn't move, and you believed it because it was designed for you to believe it. That statement hit harder than the mark on her skin. Alina let out a short, sharp breath. That's not an answer. It is the only one that matters, Kale replied. Silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was layered, heavy with implications neither of them were naming yet. Alina pushed off the pillar slightly, forcing herself to stand upright without support. The mark on her chest flared again in response, and she gritted her teeth through it. So what now? She asked. You tell me I've been bonded without consent, that my body is reacting to something I don't understand, and that I've been manipulated from the start. What exactly do you expect me to do with that information? Kale's gaze didn't soften, but it shifted. Not toward emotion, toward something more dangerous. Expectation. That depends, he said quietly, on the question you're finally willing to ask. Alina frowned. I've been asking questions since I got here. No, he said immediately. You've been defending yourself. That distinction made something inside her hesitate. There's a difference? She asked. Kale took a slow step closer again, stopping at a distance that forced her to acknowledge him fully. Not as an enemy, not as an ally, as something structurally central to whatever reality this was becoming. Yes, he said. Defensive questions try to preserve what you already believe. Real questions destroy it. Alina didn't respond immediately, because that was uncomfortably accurate. Everything she had asked so far had been anchored in rejection. This is impossible. This is not legal. This is not real. But none of those questions had touched the one thing she was now starting to feel beneath everything else. The mark was not random. It was not symbolic. It was responsive, which meant it was part of a system she had not yet understood. Kale's voice lowered again. "So, I will ask you again," he said, not as council authority, not as protocol, but as the only person in this room who has seen what happens when the bond stabilizes. Alina's jaw tightened. She didn't like where this was going. "Ask it," she said anyway. Kyle held her gaze. "If the bond is real," he said slowly, "and if rejecting it now means triggering a chain of events you cannot reverse." He paused just long enough for the weight of it to settle. "Would you still try to escape it, even if it destroys you?" The question didn't sound like philosophy. It sounded like warning. And for the first time since she entered the chamber, Alina didn't answer immediately. Because buried beneath her training, beneath her mission logic, beneath every rule she had ever followed, something inconvenient was beginning to surface. Curiosity. Not about the bond. About him. About why he wasn't forcing her compliance. About why he was giving her space to choose at all. About what kind of system would require consent after removal of choice had already occurred. The mark pulsed again, softer this time, almost like it was waiting for her decision. Kyle didn't rush her. He simply watched. And in that silence, the real danger wasn't the power imbalance anymore. It was the possibility that she might not want to run fast enough to avoid finding out the truth. The mission had not begun in the bonding chamber. It had begun in silence, long before Alina Vire ever stepped into Kale Draven's territory. Long before her skin carried a mark she didn't understand. Long before she stood face to face with a man whose existence bent the rules of every system she had ever trained under. It had begun in a sealed briefing room beneath the Central Accord archives, and where the air always smelled faintly of sterilized metal and old secrets that refused to die. Alina remembered that room with perfect clarity now, as if her mind had decided to rewind everything in search of an explanation that still made sense. She sat at a rectangular obsidian table surrounded by 3 officials she had never seen outside classified assignments. Their faces were intentionally forgettable. That was the first rule of operations like this. Never give the operative a person they could later identify in memory. Only roles, only voices, only authority, without identity. The man speaking to her had been labeled Director Sable in her file. Not his real name. Probably not even a consistent one. He slid a thin black dossier across the table toward her without ceremony. No greeting, no preamble. Just the weight of inevitability disguised as paperwork. "You've been selected for an infiltration directive," he said. Alina didn't touch the file yet. She studied it first. That was her habit. People who rushed into classified work rarely survived it. "Infiltration of what?" she asked, though she already knew the answer would not be simple. "An Alpha Dominion bonding structure," he replied. That alone tightened something behind her ribs. Alpha territories were not uncommon in her line of work, but Kale Draven's domain was not just uncommon. It was politically untouchable, structurally insulated. Entire intelligence divisions had attempted penetration and returned with nothing but missing agents and rewritten reports. "That's not infiltration," she said carefully. "That's suicide with paperwork." One of the silent officials shifted slightly. The sound of fabric against chair leather was loud in the sterile room. Director Sable didn't react to her wording. "You misunderstand the objective," he said. "You are not infiltrating his territory. You are entering it with authorization." Alina finally looked at the dossier. Authorization from who? From the bond accord itself, Sable said. That made her pause. Not because she trusted the accord, but because she understood how rarely it issued active directives against sovereign alphas. Continue, she said. Sable tapped the dossier once. Cale Draven is suspected of maintaining an unregistered genetic lineage stabilization protocol within his estate. Meaning? She asked. Meaning, he said slowly. He is either protecting something the Accord does not recognize, or he is the thing it was designed to suppress. The room felt colder after that sentence, even though nothing in it should have changed temperature. Alina leaned back slightly, crossing one leg over the other in a controlled motion that kept her posture neutral. And my role? Sable's gaze didn't shift. You will enter his domain under the guise of a sanctioned mate agreement. That was the first moment she almost laughed. Almost. She didn't, because laughter in rooms like this was a form of surrender. Say that again, she said instead. A mate agreement, Sable repeated. Temporary, structured, politically justified under Treaty Clause 17. Alina stared at him for a long moment. You're asking me to fake a bond with Cale Draven. We are asking you to simulate compliance within a binding framework, he corrected. Words matter. So does reality, she replied immediately. One of the other officials finally spoke, voice low and cautious. The simulation is necessary for access. His estate does not permit external surveillance. The only entry point is relational integration. Alina turned her gaze slightly toward him. Relational integration? She echoed. That's your euphemism for deception? The man didn't respond. That silence was answer enough. She turned back to Sable. And what exactly am I supposed to do once I'm inside? Sable slid a second document across the table. Smaller, thinner, more dangerous in its simplicity. Observe, map internal structure, identify anomalies in genetic containment protocols. Confirm or deny the existence of unauthorized hybrid stabilization. Alina opened the second file. The first page contained only a single image. Cale Draven. No smile. No context. Just a face that looked like it had never needed permission to exist. Beneath it, a short summary. Alpha designation. Draven. Territory. Northern Dominion. Status. Unclassified anomaly. Threat classification. Unresolved. That last word bothered her more than anything else. Unresolved implied the system had tried and failed to categorize him. That meant unpredictability. And unpredictability meant casualties. And the bond? She asked. It's fake, Sable said immediately. Entirely procedural. Symbolic registration only. Then why does it require me to physically enter a binding chamber? She pressed. Sable didn't answer right away. That pause mattered. Alina noticed it immediately. Because, he said finally, he will not accept symbolic bonds unless they are reinforced in person. And what if he rejects it? Sable's expression didn't change. He won't. That certainty was more unsettling than uncertainty would have been. Alina closed the dossier slowly. You're asking me to walk into the most dangerous alpha domain in the region under the pretense of a fake bond that he will apparently accept without question. And you expect me to extract intelligence without triggering retaliation. Correct, Sable said. Alina exhaled once through her nose. That's not a mission. That's a controlled death scenario. It is controlled, he replied. That's the point. The word controlled stuck in her mind longer than it should have. Because nothing about Cale Draven had ever been described as controlled in any public record. He was the opposite of control. He was contained force, the kind that only appeared stable from a distance. Alina tapped the dossier once with her finger. And if I refuse? Sable didn't hesitate. There is no refusal condition. That was the second time the room had gone silent. Not metaphorically. Literally. Even the air seemed to pause. Alina's gaze hardened. You're telling me this is mandatory. We are telling you this is already in motion. He corrected again. You are simply the designated operative. That sentence shifted something in her perception. Not fear. Not yet. Recognition of removal of agency. That was worse than threat. So, I don't get a choice, she said slowly. You get execution parameters, Sable replied. That is choice enough in this context. Alina stared at him for a long moment. Then she smiled slightly. Not because she found it amusing, because she understood the structure now. You've already prepared the bond registration, she said. Haven't you? Sable didn't deny it. That was answer number 3. Alina leaned forward slightly. And Cale Draven is aware? A pause. He has been notified of an incoming bonded candidate, Sable said carefully. But not the nature of the assignment. So he thinks I'm real? She said. He thinks you are viable, Sable corrected. Alina closed the dossier fully now. Viable, she repeated quietly. The word felt like a classification of livestock rather than a person. Sable continued. Once inside, you will maintain proximity under mate designation protocols. This will grant you unrestricted access to restricted zones. And if the bond activates? She asked. That was the first time Sable hesitated visibly. Just slightly. A flicker. It will not, he said. Alina tilted her head. That wasn't an answer. It is the only answer you are authorized to receive, he replied. She studied him for a moment longer, then leaned back again. Something about this entire structure was off. Not just dangerous, intentionally incomplete. Like pieces of information had been removed not to conceal truth, but to shape behavior. That was when she asked the question that should have stopped everything. Who chose me for this? Sable didn't respond immediately. One of the other officials shifted again, this time more noticeably. The sound of fabric felt louder now. You were selected based on compatibility metrics, Sable said. Compatibility with what? Alina asked. Another pause. Longer this time. With him, Sable said finally. That sentence landed differently than anything before it, because it implied measurement, not assignment, not chance, measurement. Like she and Cale Draven were variables in a system designed to converge. Alina stood slowly. So let me understand this correctly, she said. You want me to enter a sovereign alpha domain, fake a mate bond with a man I've been told is structurally unstable, extract classified genetic intelligence, and trust that none of this will activate something irreversible between us. Sable nodded once. Yes. Alina held his gaze. And you call that controlled? It is contained, he corrected again. That distinction felt like a lie dressed as precision. Alina picked up the dossier again, then placed it back on the table. If this goes wrong, she said, I assume I'm expendable. Sable's answer was immediate. Everyone is. That was the final truth of the briefing. Not the mission, not the bond, not Cale Draven. That sentence. Alina remembered walking out of that room without another word, because anything she said after that would have been emotional rather than operational. And emotion had no place in assignments like this. But now, standing in Cale Draven's chamber, feeling the mark on her skin react to his presence, she understood something she hadn't understood then. The mission was never about infiltration. It was about insertion, not into territory, into him. And somewhere between that briefing room and this moment, in the word fake had stopped meaning what she thought it meant. Because systems that powerful did not rely on lies alone. They relied on truths you were only allowed to discover after it was too late to refuse them. Cale Draven did not enter a room the way other men did. He didn't announce himself, he didn't demand attention, and he didn't need ceremony to shift the balance of power in any space he occupied. He simply existed within it, and everything else adjusted around that fact, as if the environment itself had learned long ago not to resist him. Alina realized that fully not in the moment she first saw him, but in the moments after, when her mind tried to reconstruct the encounter and kept failing to find a version of reality where he was simply a man rather than a structural anomaly in human form. Even now, standing only a few feet away from him in the bonding chamber, she could feel the difference between him and everyone else in the room as something physical rather than conceptual. It wasn't just his presence, it was the way everything else in his orbit seemed slightly delayed, like reality itself was reacting to him a fraction too late to feel natural. The council members remained frozen in their elevated seats, their faces carefully neutral, but their bodies betrayed them in small, involuntary adjustments, subtle shifts of posture, tightened grips, lowered gazes. They were not reacting to a man. They were reacting to a known outcome. Kale stood at the center of that stillness as if it belonged to him. Not in a performative way, not in a theatrical display of dominance, but in the quiet certainty of someone who had never needed to compete for space in his life because space had already been taught to accommodate him. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, yet every line of him carried a kind of structural precision that suggested restraint rather than ease. He wasn't loose, he was contained. And that containment was more unsettling than any visible aggression could have been. Alina watched him carefully now, her training forcing her to analyze instead of react. Height, above average, but not extreme. Build, lean but dense, the kind of physical composition that suggested endurance rather than brute strength. Movement, minimal, economical, no wasted motion. Eyes, silver gray, but not reflective in the ordinary sense. More like something polished to a surface that didn't allow emotional distortion to linger. Everything about him was measurable, and yet nothing about him felt fully measurable at all. That contradiction was the first thing that made her uneasy. Kale's gaze was still fixed on her, but not in the way most predators studied prey. There was no hunger in it, no visible aggression, no emotional leakage that could be used to predict intent. Instead, there was assessment. Continuous, layered, almost mechanical in its precision. It felt less like being looked at and more like being read. "You're analyzing me," he said suddenly. His voice cut through the chamber without raising volume. It didn't echo. It didn't need to. Alina didn't flinch, but she adjusted her stance slightly, grounding herself. "It would be irresponsible not to," she replied. Kale's expression didn't change. "Irresponsible," he repeated quietly, as if testing the word rather than responding to it. Around them, the council remained silent, but Alina could sense their attention tightening further. This was not a public exchange in the traditional sense. It was a controlled observation of two variables placed in proximity under unknown conditions. Kale took a slow step forward. Just one. That single movement altered the spatial dynamics of the chamber more than any declaration could have. Alina felt it immediately, not as fear, but as pressure. Like the air between them had condensed slightly. "Tell me what you see," he said. It was not a request. It was not an order either. It existed somewhere between invitation and evaluation. Alina hesitated for only a fraction of a second before responding. "Control," she said, but not the kind people usually mean when they use that word. A faint shift passed through his eyes. Not surprise, recognition of accuracy. She continued, carefully now. "You don't react impulsively. You don't escalate emotionally. You don't waste movement or speech. Everything you do seems pre-decided." Kyle tilted his head slightly. "Pre-decided," he echoed. "That's your interpretation." "It's an observation," she corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there?" he asked. The question wasn't challenging her intelligence, it was probing the foundation of how she defined certainty. Alina narrowed her eyes slightly. Yes, she said. Interpretation involves assumption. Observation requires evidence. Kale's gaze held steady. And what evidence do you have for me? The question hung in the air longer than expected, because it was not just about him. It was about the limits of what she had been allowed to see. Alina realized then that everything she had been briefed on, the dossiers, the classifications, even the carefully controlled psychological framing of this mission, had been filtered. Not to hide Kale Draven, but to constrain how she would perceive him. Very little, she admitted. That honesty shifted something subtle in the room, not in Kale, in the environment around them. The council members seemed to straighten slightly, as if that admission changed the trajectory of the interaction. Kale, however, remained unchanged. If anything, he seemed slightly more attentive. That's the first accurate thing you've said since entering this chamber, he said calmly. Alina didn't respond immediately. The mark beneath her skin pulsed faintly, reminding her of its presence in a way that felt synchronized with his proximity. She ignored it. You expected me to be inaccurate? She asked. I expected you to be controlled, he replied. There's a difference. Alina studied him again, more carefully this time. Controlled by what? She asked. Kale's gaze didn't shift away from her. By belief, he said simply. That answer did not clarify anything. Instead, it expanded the ambiguity. You think I came here believing something false? She asked. I think you came here believing something incomplete, he corrected. That distinction mattered more than it should have. Before she could respond, Kale turned slightly, not away from her, but enough to indicate the room itself. Look at them, he said. Alina followed his gesture briefly. The council members remained silent, but their stillness was no longer passive. It was attentive in a different way. Not observers of a confrontation, but participants in an equation. They're not reacting to us, she said quietly. They're monitoring outcome probability, Kale replied. They already know most possible branches. That statement unsettled her more than anything else so far. And we're just variables, she said. Kale looked back at her. You are, he said. I am not. The certainty in that statement was absolute, not arrogant, not defensive, absolute. Alina's brows tightened slightly. Everyone is a variable in a system, she said. That's basic operational theory. Not in mine, Kale replied. The simplicity of that answer made it more difficult to dismiss. He took another slow step closer. Now the distance between them was minimal, but still not breached. He stopped just outside what would normally be considered personal space boundaries, but somehow still inside her perception of safety. That was a paradox she didn't like acknowledging. Tell me what you think I am, he said again. Alina hesitated. This time not for tactical reasons, but because every possible answer felt insufficient. Finally, she chose the most neutral framing she could. A dominant alpha with institutional control over a closed territory, she said. Highly disciplined, highly strategic, possibly non-compliant with Accord oversight. Kale listened without interruption. When she finished, he nodded once. That's what they told you to see, he said. Not entirely, she replied. I reached some of it myself. Good, he said. That single word carried no praise, only confirmation. Then he stepped back slightly, just enough to change the pressure in the air. Now look again, he said. Alina frowned slightly. At what? Kale raised one hand slowly, not toward her, but toward the chamber itself. And for the first time since she had entered, she noticed something she had previously filtered out without realizing it. The architecture. The way the chamber's design subtly curved inward at specific points. The alignment of pillars not according to aesthetic symmetry, but directional focus. The placement of council seating not for hierarchy alone, but for observation angles. This was not just a room, and it was a system designed around a central node, and that node was him. "This place is built around you," she said quietly. Kale didn't confirm it verbally. He didn't need to. "That's not dominance," she added slowly. "That's infrastructure." "Exactly," he said. The realization settled into her mind in layers. Because dominance implied struggle, infrastructure implied permanence. One could be challenged. The other had already replaced resistance entirely. Alina looked back at him. "So, what are you really?" she asked. Kyle met her gaze again, and for the first time, something faintly human flickered behind his controlled exterior. Not emotion, not vulnerability. Recognition of complexity. "That," he said quietly, "is the question you were never supposed to ask this early." The mark beneath her skin pulsed again, stronger this time, as if responding not to proximity now, but to understanding itself beginning to form. And in that moment, Alina realized something that made her breath slow slightly. Kale Draven was not simply the opposing force in her mission. He was the standard everything else in this system had been built around, whether anyone admitted it or not. And if that was true, then the real question was not what he was, but what had been designed to contain him, and why she had been inserted directly into the center of it. The first thing Alina noticed after the chamber confrontation was not a new threat or an immediate escalation. It was how quickly everything around her began to normalize what should not have been normal at all. Within minutes, the council resumed its structured composure. Guards returned to rigid ceremonial stillness. Ian and even Kale Draven himself stepped back into the rhythm of controlled authority, as if the previous exchange had simply been another scheduled event, rather than a fracture in reality itself. That shift unsettled her more than open hostility would have, because hostility was readable. Hostility followed patterns. But this seamless transition back into order after something clearly unstable, suggested something deeper, something practiced. Like chaos was not an interruption in this environment. It was part of the design. Alina was escorted from the central chamber under the guise of orientation protocol, though no one bothered to explain what she was being oriented toward. Two silent attendants led her through a series of corridors carved into dark stone and polished metal, and the architecture changing subtly as they moved deeper into Kale Draven's estate. At first, the halls were ceremonial, tall ceilings, symmetrical lighting, and walls adorned with engraved insignias representing alpha lineage authority. But as they progressed, symmetry began to degrade in ways that were too intentional to be accidental. Hallways tilted slightly off alignment, not enough to be disorienting immediately, but enough to create subconscious imbalance over time. Light sources became uneven, casting shadows that didn't always correspond to physical structures. Doors appeared where there should have been solid walls, and walls appeared where logic suggested passageways should exist. Alina tracked everything. That was her default state. But even her trained cognition began to register something troubling. The estate was not designed for navigation. It was designed for behavioral influence. The attendants did not speak. That, too, was intentional. Silence in unfamiliar environments was never neutral. It either created fear or dependence. In this case, it was doing both. After several minutes of walking, they reached a transition corridor that felt different from the rest. The air temperature shifted slightly, cooler and more stable. The lighting dimmed into a soft, diffused glow that eliminated harsh shadows. And the sound, though minimal before, seemed to disappear entirely. Alina paused briefly, noticing the absence of ambient resonance. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. The attendants did not answer. They simply stopped at a large arched doorway, embedded with metallic veins that pulsed faintly beneath the surface like dormant circuitry. One of them raised a hand and placed it against a panel beside the door. A moment later, it opened without sound. Beyond it was not a corridor, but a chamber designed to appear deceptively informal. It resembled a lounge, but nothing about it felt recreational. Seating was arranged in asymmetric clusters rather than structured order. Surfaces were smooth but intentionally uneven in elevation. Even the lighting shifted dynamically depending on where one stood, subtly altering perception of depth and distance. This was not a resting space. It was a controlled, social environment. Alina stepped inside cautiously. The attendants remained at the threshold and then withdrew without explanation, leaving her alone in the space. The door closed behind her with a soft, mechanical certainty that felt more like finality than security. She took a slow breath and began scanning the room systematically. Multiple exits, but only one visibly accessible. Surveillance points hidden within architectural seams. No visible weapons, but that was irrelevant. Rooms like this did not require weapons to be dangerous. They required people. And people were always the most effective instruments of control. That was when she noticed them. Not immediately as individuals, but as presence clusters. 3 figures already inside the chamber, positioned in ways that did not appear coincidental. A woman seated near the central curve of the room, dressed in formal neutral-toned attire that suggested administrative authority. A man standing near the far end, he leaning casually against a structure that resembled a display console, and another figure partially obscured by shifting light patterns, seated but angled in a way that allowed constant observation of both entrances and Alina's position. None of them moved when she entered. That was the first signal. They had been expecting her. The woman spoke first. "You're later than projected." Her tone was not hostile, it was factual. Alina remained standing. Projection models are often inaccurate in unfamiliar environments. She replied evenly. The woman smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "That depends on what variables are known," she said. The man at the far end chuckled softly. "Or who is doing the modeling?" he added. Alina didn't respond to either of them directly. Instead, she adjusted her stance slightly, in positioning herself so she had equal visual access to all 3. "You're not part of the escort detail," she said. The woman nodded. "Correct." "Then what are you?" Alina asked. A brief pause followed, just long enough to feel intentional. "We observe integration outcomes," the woman said. "Integration?" Alina repeated. The man tilted his head slightly. "You were selected for a bonding directive," he said. "That makes you relevant to multiple observational streams." Alina felt a subtle tightening in her chest, but her expression remained unchanged. "I wasn't informed I would be observed," she said. The seated figure finally shifted slightly, bringing their face partially into view. A young man, calm expression, eyes too focused to be casual. "Most subjects aren't," he said simply. The word subjects was not accidental. Alina registered it immediately. "Subjects," she repeated. The woman nodded again, as if confirming classification. "It's standard during initial bond activation phases." Alina exhaled slowly through her nose. "There is no activation phase," she said firmly. The man laughed softly again. "That depends on whether you believe the bond is artificial or latent," he said. Alina's gaze sharpened slightly. "I believe it is classified as procedural," she replied. The woman leaned forward slightly, resting her hands together. "Classification is a matter of framing," she said, "not truth." That sentence was carefully constructed. Alina recognized manipulation when it was embedded in philosophy, rather than instruction. She took a slow step forward into the room, intentionally breaking their static expectation of her position. "Why am I here?" she asked again, this time more direct. The seated man spoke. "To observe whether the bond stabilizes under controlled social exposure." Alina narrowed her eyes. "Controlled by who?" The woman smiled faintly again. "By those who understand it," she said. That answer was deliberately vague. Alina stepped further into the room, now intentionally disrupting their spatial assumptions. "And Cale Draven understands it?" she asked. That question shifted the atmosphere subtly, not dramatically. Just enough to register. The man at the far end straightened slightly. "He is part of the system," he said carefully. "Not outside it." Alina processed that immediately. "So he is also being observed?" she said. The woman nodded. "Everything is." That was the second layer of manipulation revealed. Not secrecy, but normalization. And the idea that surveillance was not an intrusion, but a constant state of existence. Alina studied them more closely now. None of them appeared nervous. That meant they either believed they held control, or they had been trained to appear as though they did. She decided to test the structure. "What happens if I reject the bond completely?" she asked. The seated man responded immediately. "You can't," he said. "It's already active." That sentence landed differently than before, because it contradicted earlier framing. Earlier, she had been told it was procedural. Now, it was active. The inconsistency was intentional, designed to destabilize certainty. Alina turned slightly, pacing a slow semicircle within the room. "You're contradicting each other," she said calmly. The woman's smile faded slightly. "We are not," she replied. "We are describing different layers of the same system." "Which layer is correct?" Alina asked. The man answered this time. "All of them." That answer was designed to eliminate anchor points. If all interpretations were valid, then none could be challenged effectively. It was a classic cognitive destabilization strategy. Alina stopped moving and faced them directly again. "This is not observation," she said. "This is conditioning." That statement caused a brief silence. Not surprise. Evaluation. The seated figure finally spoke again. "Conditioning implies control," he said. "We prefer the term alignment." Alina's expression remained steady, but internally she was mapping the structure now. This chamber was not just a meeting space. It was a feedback environment, designed to measure response elasticity under layered social pressure. Each individual here represented a different manipulation vector: authority framing, philosophical ambiguity, and emotional normalization. "Where is Cale Draven?" she asked suddenly. The question shifted the dynamic again. The woman exchanged a glance with the man. "He is not required for this phase," she said. Alina tilted her head slightly. "And yet, everything here is structured around him." The seated man didn't deny it. That silence was confirmation. Alina exhaled slowly. "So, this is not about observation," she said. "It's about shaping how I interpret him." The woman's expression changed subtly. Not discomfort, interest. "You're more adaptive than predicted," she said. Alina met her gaze directly. "Or your predictions are based on people who comply too easily," she replied. That line shifted something in the room. Not overtly, but enough that the man at the far end stopped leaning casually. The structure of the chamber itself seemed suddenly less passive and more intentional. Alina realized then that every element of this space, its lighting, its seating, its participants, was designed not just to observe her, but to influence how she defined Cale Draven before she encountered him again. Not as a person, but as an interpretation already shaped in advance. And that was when she understood the real danger of the mission was not infiltration or exposure. It was perception engineering. Because once perception was shaped correctly, reality didn't need to be enforced. It would be accepted. Alina did not discover the hidden chamber by accident, and she would never later accept the narrative that it had been coincidence. Nothing in Kaledraven's estate happened by coincidence. Every corridor, every shift in lighting, every architectural inconsistency she had already logged in her mind was part of a larger design that did not tolerate randomness. So when she found herself alone later that night, moving through a section of the estate that the attendants had never formally authorized her to enter, she understood immediately that either she was being guided without consent, or she had finally reached the part of the system that no longer pretended she was supposed to stay ignorant. It began with silence. Not the artificial silence of ceremonial chambers or controlled social rooms, but a deeper absence of sound that suggested the space was insulated from the rest of the estate entirely. Even her footsteps felt muted, as if the environment was absorbing information rather than reflecting it. The corridor she had taken was not marked on any visible schematic she had been shown. That alone confirmed her suspicion that she had been given partial access maps designed to misdirect rather than inform. The further she walked, the more the structure changed. The walls were no longer polished stone or ceremonial metal. They became older, layered with faint markings that were not decorative, but functional. Thin etched lines ran in geometric sequences that repeated at irregular intervals, forming patterns that did not correspond to any known architectural language she had studied. She paused once, pressing her fingers lightly against the surface. There was warmth beneath the material. Not heat from machinery, but residual energy, like something had been active here recently or continuously. That realization tightened her focus immediately. This was not a forgotten section of the estate. It was maintained. Hidden did not mean abandoned. It meant concealed. She moved forward again, slower now, deliberately mapping every step. After several turns that defied logical architectural continuity, she reached a section where the corridor narrowed sharply into a vertical seam between two seemingly solid walls. At first glance, it appeared to be a dead end. But Alina had learned long ago that dead ends in controlled environments rarely existed without purpose. She examined the seam carefully. There were no visible handles, no biometric panels, no mechanical triggers. But there was something else, a faint vibration beneath the surface, almost imperceptible, like a locked mechanism waiting for a specific frequency or presence to activate it. Then she felt it again. The mark. Not pain this time. Recognition. It pulsed beneath her collarbone with a steady rhythm that aligned almost perfectly with the faint vibration in the wall. Alina froze. That synchronization was not random. Slowly she stepped closer, lowering her voice instinctively even though there was no one to hear her. "So it is keyed," she murmured. She raised her hand and hesitated just long enough to confirm her suspicion. Then she pressed her palm against the seam. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then the wall reacted. Not by sliding or mechanically unlocking, but by dissolving its surface pattern. The etched lines lit up faintly, responding to something embedded in her biological signature. A low, almost inaudible hum filled the corridor, and the seam split open vertically as if reality itself had been unstitched. Beyond it was darkness, not absence of light, but controlled absence of reflection. A space designed not to reveal itself until fully entered. Alina stepped inside without hesitation. The door sealed behind her immediately, cutting her off from the corridor she had just traversed. The room beyond was vast, but not in the traditional sense. It was not open space. It was layered containment. Multiple levels descended into the ground, each one partially visible through transparent structural barriers that shimmered faintly with active stabilization fields. This was not a storage room. It was a containment archive. And at its center stood a circular platform surrounded by suspended data structures that rotated slowly in midair, projecting streams of genetic sequences, lineage maps, and biological classifications that shifted continuously as if updating in real time. Alina's breath slowed. She had seen classified archives before, military ones, council-controlled ones, black site repositories designed to hold restricted knowledge. But this was different. This was not a record of information, it was a live system. And then she saw it. Her name. Not just her name, but her biological identifier embedded within a sequence cluster labeled Primary Bonded Candidate Array. She stepped closer instinctively, eyes narrowing as she scanned the projection. Dozens of profiles were listed, each linked to specific alpha signatures. But hers was highlighted differently, not as a match, as a convergence point. Beneath it, Cale Draven's designation appeared. Not in parallel, not as counterpart, but as anchor node. Alina felt a slow tightening in her chest. "No," she whispered. She extended her hand toward the projection, and the moment she did, the system reacted. Additional layers unfolded around her, revealing records that had been intentionally obscured in every briefing she had ever received. Historical logs, council directives, genetic compatibility charts spanning decades. And beneath all of it, a single repeated phrase across multiple classified entries. Stabilization requires direct pairing with anchor subject Cale Draven. Her mind worked rapidly, trying to reframe what she was seeing. This was not a simple mate assignment. It was a structural dependency system. She stepped further into the chamber, and the projections adjusted to her presence, as if recognizing her as an active participant rather than an observer. That was when she noticed the secondary layer beneath the data archive, a deeper containment field sealed behind biometric locks that mirrored her mark's frequency. She approached it slowly. "What is this?" she whispered. The system did not answer verbally. Instead, it revealed additional records. Restricted. Redacted. Then forcibly decrypted as her proximity destabilized the lock. What emerged made her stop completely. Council authorization logs. Not current council. Older. Pre-accord restructuring. Names she did not recognize, associated with directives involving controlled hybrid stabilization programs, genetic containment strategies, and forced relational binding protocols designed to prevent uncontrolled alpha evolution events. Cale Draven's name appeared repeatedly throughout these records, not as subject alone, but as origin point. Then she saw the classification that made her breath catch. Containment anchor entity, Draven lineage subject 0. Alina stepped back instinctively. Subject 0. She repeated under her breath. That designation was not standard. It meant origin anomaly, a genetic or systemic source from which deviations were measured. And then the projection expanded again, revealing a timeline she had never been given access to. Cale Draven was not simply an alpha with political dominance. He was the result of a failed containment experiment decades in the making. And a living stabilizer for something the Council had once tried to control and failed to eliminate. And the bond system, her bond system, was not designed for partnership. It was designed for regulation. Alina felt her pulse quicken. The mark beneath her skin flared again, stronger this time, as if responding to the data itself. "This isn't a mate bond," she said quietly. "It's a containment interface." The system did not correct her. That silence confirmed everything. She turned slowly, scanning the chamber again, and noticed something she had missed before. This entire facility was not simply storing information about bonds, it was actively monitoring them. Real-time emotional, biological, and proximity-based data feeds streamed across the lower layers, updating continuously as subjects interacted across the estate. And one stream was already active, hers, linked directly to Cale Draven. Alina's mind began reconstructing the implications rapidly. She had not been sent to infiltrate Cale Draven's domain. She had been placed into a live stabilization system designed to regulate his condition through proximity pairing. But that meant something far worse than manipulation. It meant her consent had never been part of the equation because the system did not require consent. It required compatibility. And then the final layer unlocked. A sealed directive embedded at the core of the archive. When it opened, it contained a single sentence. If anchor subject Draven destabilizes beyond containment threshold, bonded candidate will serve as corrective termination vector. Alina stared at the words for a long moment without blinking, and the implication was immediate and absolute. She was not just a participant in a fake mate agreement. She was a fail-safe, a living countermeasure embedded into a relational system designed to neutralize Kale Draven if necessary. And worse, he likely already knew. Or worse still, had designed it that way. Behind her, the sealed entrance of the chamber remained closed, but Alina no longer felt trapped. She felt placed. Every step she had taken, every corridor she had walked, every interaction she had experienced since entering the estate had been calibrated toward this discovery. Not to reveal truth randomly, but to stage it. The question was no longer what Kale Draven was hiding. The question was whether he was the prisoner of this system or its architect. And somewhere deep within the estate, far beyond the archive chamber, the mark on her skin pulsed once more, steady, deliberate, almost like a signal confirming that she had finally reached the level where ignorance was no longer permitted.